Welcome to Screen Layouts in Common UI. In this section, we're going to quickly revisit the theme definition and view where it defines the layout block. And what we're going to find is that the layout block helps define how new screens will be created. It also happens to be inside of the Common UI flow, because the Common UI flow has a number of common blocks. Not only does it have the layout block, but it also has the menu and the bottom bar blocks. So we'll talk about those blocks. We'll also talk about the global exception handler in the Common UI flow and some of the common screens and their screen actions. And at the end, we'll wrap up by looking at how a module defines some properties that is going to use some of the information in the Common UI and inside of the layout block. So let's go ahead and get started. If we think back to our theme definition, the theme defines how the overall look and feel of our application is going to be, and one of the things that it defines is the common layout block. So if we revisit our theme, we can see that our to-do theme, which is named after our module, does have at the very bottom some blocks that are important, and the first block defined is the layout block. And that's actually in the Common UI flow, and there is the layout block itself. So that layout block is going to be the way screens are created by default for this particular module. Now when we look at this layout block, the screens that get created are going to use this block by default. And the screen has a particular structure that it defines with its placeholders. And there are placeholders like the title, the content, and the bottom. So here we can see an empty view of the layout, and if we look to the right, here we can see the layout block as it would be defined in the element area, and if we look down at the bottom, there's a header left up at the top, and then in the middle there's the title and the header right. Right below that there's a header content area followed by the content in the bottom. So if we go in the opposite direction, the bottom is here, this is the content, this is the header content area, and then we go from the header right to the title to the header left. And that gives us the overall layout for the screen. We can also see that the layout has a number of other things. It has a pull to refresh implementation. So if you've worked with devices and you pull down on a screen and it sort of jumps back in a rubber band kind of function to move, it automatically refreshes things on the screen. So by default, the layout block has a pull to refresh implementation if we choose to use it. And to be able to use some of these features, there are events that the block defines as well. Synchronization type events, pull to refresh events, and then it has event handlers to help us handle and work with these types of events as well. So here you can see we can choose to define things like, are we going to use pull to refresh? Are we going to hide the header when we actually are scrolling things? And then we do have these events. We have different types of synchronization events for when we stop and finish, or there are synchronization errors. And then we also have whether or not we're going to be using pull to refresh and if an event for pull to refresh has actually occurred. So there's a lot going on inside of the layout, but when we look at it, there's actually nothing there, because this is the underlying framework that gives us the capability to do any of these types of things on any given screen. And then once we go ahead and create a screen, the screen gets all of this from the layout block, and then we can begin modifying how that screen is going to work. Now, the layout block is actually here inside of the Common UI flow. And there's not just one layout, there's actually a layout blank. So the layout that we just looked at had everything that you might want by default inside of the layout. The layout blank actually has nothing inside of it except for the synchronization events. So in case there's data in there that we want to synchronize, those synchronization capabilities are left inside of the layout blank. But when we look through the UI flows, the first UI flow by default is the Common UI flow, and it has inside of it exceptions, different screens, different blocks, and a redirector. So here's the onException that handles all of our exceptions. There are three types of screens: invalid permission, login, and splash screens. lots of blocks, and we'll talk about some of these, and then the redirector at the bottom. So we can see them listed inside of the elements tree here, and if we double clicked on the common flow, it would open up inside of the editor area, and it would look like this, where we'd see a bunch of the screens, we'd see all of the blocks, and the redirector as well. So these are all the common UI flow elements that we can use and that can be leveraged inside of the screens that we build. So it's important that we know what they do and how we can use them. So if we start, one of the things in the common UI flow is the menu block. And this is basically an overlay for menu items. So this could hold navigation to different screens that we might wish to go to. And if we drag and drop a screen to the menu block, it will automatically add it to the list of screens in the block. It also contains a user info block, and it allows us to log out if we want to. So inside of the common UI, we have the menu block, and we have the client logout action. And here we have that user info block at the top, and we've dragged the dashboard, the to-dos, the create new to-do screen, the category screen, and the data screen. And at the bottom, there's always an if that will let us log out if we're currently logged in, or log in if we're logged out. So this type of menu allows us to navigate and see some of the information about the user as well. Now, the menu is obviously up at the top of the overall layout. The bottom bar block is all the way at the bottom. And the bottom bar block is similar to the menu block in that the menu can help us navigate. The bottom bar block is also meant as a navigation device. So it's positioned at the bottom of the screen, and we can place bottom bar items, which are one of our UI patterns. We can place those inside of the bottom bar block to go ahead and implement some of that navigation. By default, the bottom bar block is empty. It doesn't have anything inside of it. But it does have an input parameter so that if we add bottom bar items, it will tell it which of the items is the active item at that time. So here you can see that the bottom bar takes an input of the active item. When we look at the overall page, here's a to-do screen. It has the common layout, and if we go to the bottom placeholder, we can see that the bottom bar is there. This is the bottom bar, and inside the bottom bar we can see that we have 5 sets of icons and text, and those are bottom bar items. So each icon with a piece of text is actually a bottom bar icon, and these will go ahead and allow us to navigate to the dashboard and the other types of screens that we're interested in. And it knows which one is currently active because when the bottom bar is being rendered, the active item is passed into it so that it knows which of these would be the active screen. Now, while we're working with the menu and the bottom bar, the overall layout and the screens are there, occasionally we run into different types of exceptions. There is, in the common UI flow, a global exception handler. So this onException action can handle security exceptions, communication exceptions, and any other type of exception that occurs. If there's a security exception, it figures out whether it knows who the user is. If we know who the user is, then the security exception would be that they're trying to get to a page that they don't have permission for. So we should go to the invalid permission screen. If we don't know who the user is, then we should ask them to log in. So the security exception is fairly straightforward. The communication exception would get thrown when we can't connect or can't get to or get a slow response from whatever we're trying to communicate with. And then the communication exception will tell the user that we weren't able to connect to whatever we were trying to connect to. Plus, besides those types of exceptions, any other exceptions that bubble up to the level of the layout of the screen, there is an all exceptions that would catch any other exception. So this is the onException block, and the onException sets of actions are going to try to handle any of these exceptions. Now, we did talk about that onExceptions rerouting us to some of the different screens. Well, in the common UI, we have the splash screen, which is what's going to be displayed when we're trying to load the application. We have the login screen that's been created for us to take a user ID and a password and allow us to log in. And then we also have the invalid permission screen, which is the screen that's going to get thrown when a security exception occurs, when we know who you are, but you don't have the correct access to get to the original page that you had requested. So all of those screens come pre-built. We could obviously change and customize these to make them more appropriate for our application. Now, the common screen also has different actions. So the splash screen will begin loading, and it will load, and when it is complete, then it will then redirect to the default screen. The splash screen also checks whether or not there's a new version of the application available. So if we find a new version, then we'll begin the upgrade process, which includes downloading the new resources that the application will need. So the splash screen is the one that worries about the upgrade process and loading the full application. The login screen has a login action, and the login action is a server action. So we actually have to be online to be able to log in. And then if we log in, and there is some data that we might need from the server, there is a sync on login that is possible. So here we can see the definition of the splash screen with the load complete and the upgrade. Here we can see the definition of the login. But here's the actual login action. And when we're logging in, the do login is actually a server action. So that means we have to be online. So you can't log in while offline. We'd have to keep your user ID and password information in local storage, and that's not a good idea from a security perspective. Once you do log in and the server authenticates who you are, then we'll check whether we need to synchronize any of the offline data. And if the configuration is set to do synchronization on login, then it will immediately call sync on login, and when it finishes, it will go ahead and display the page that will be the default page. And if we're not doing synchronization, then it will redirect to whatever page that we need it to redirect to. Now, last but not least, the module that we're working in, and in our case it's our to-do module, it has a number of defaults. And the defaults are, what is the default theme for this module? What's the default screen that we will actually go to? What is the splash screen that's going to be used? What's the global exception handler? What's the default transition screen? And what's the server request timeout? So all of these defaults right here are things that we should be able to set for this particular application. So the module will use these defaults until the developer changes them. So we can change the default screen whenever we want to. We mentioned that we could modify the splash screen. We could go up and change the way the exceptions are handled in onException. Here's a default transition. When screens are transitioning, they slide in from the right, and we'll get communication exceptions if we don't get a server request response within 10 seconds. We'll say it has timed out and we're not going to wait any longer. So these are some of the key things that we can define on the module that will help describe and define exactly how our application is going to work. So we covered a lot of ground. We looked at the theme definition again to see how it defines what the layout block is going to be, and that layout block is in the common UI flow, as well as the menu, the bottom bar, the global exception handler, and some very important screen actions. And then at the end here we looked at the module properties, because we know that the module will have certain defaults, and if we wish to change those default properties, we have the power to do so. So that's it for screen layouts in Common UI. Thanks for listening.